Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we return once again to the forgotten folds of history in search of moments that shape the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here with me as we journey together into the shadows of Victorian London. Perhaps you're settling in after a long day. Or maybe these stories have become part of your nightly ritual. Whatever brings you here, know that this space is yours to find comfort in the whispered truths of the past. I'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight. Are you tucked beneath blankets in a quiet bedroom, sitting by a window as rain patters against the glass? Do share in the comments how these evening stories fit into your world. It brings me such joy to know we're connected across time and space by these shared moments of reflection. Tonight we'll walk the fog-shrouded streets of 1870s London, but not through the grand boulevards or glittering ballrooms that so often capture our imagination. Instead, we'll slip quietly into the drawing rooms and back parlors where Victorian women lived lives that history has largely forgotten. Lives touched by a silent epidemic that crept through every layer of society like morning mist, seeping through window frames. The story we'll uncover together is one of laudanum and longing, of respectability and secret suffering, of women who found themselves caught between the crushing expectations of propriety and the gentle embrace of opium's false promises. It's a tale that speaks to something eternal in the human experience, the lengths we go to soothe pain that cannot be spoken aloud. Let us begin in the autumn of 1872. In a terraced house on Bloomsbury's Gordon Square, the gaslight flickers against burgundy wallpaper as Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, 34 years of age, sits at her mahogany writing desk. To any observer, she appears the picture of Victorian respectability. Her dark hair swept back in a perfect chignon, her morning dress of finest silk arranged without a wrinkle. Yet Eleanor's hands tremble slightly as she lifts a small brown bottle to her lips. The bottle bears an innocuous label, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for children's teething troubles. But Eleanor has no teething child. She has no child at all, having lost 3 infants in their first months of life. The syrup, thick and sweet with honey and tinged with the bitter kiss of morphine, has become her companion through the endless afternoons of genteel mourning that Victorian society demands of her. Eleanor is not alone in her quiet dependency. Across London, in grand houses and modest lodgings alike, women like her have discovered that the very medicines prescribed for their delicate constitutions and nervous conditions offer more than mere relief. They offer escape from a world that has built itself around their silence. Dr. William Morrison, Eleanor's physician, prescribed the laudanum initially for what he termed feminine hysteria, that catch-all diagnosis that Victorian medicine applied to any woman whose grief, frustration, or exhaustion dared to show itself. Just a few drops in your evening tea, he had suggested with paternal kindness. It will calm your nerves and help you sleep. What Dr. Morrison didn't mention, perhaps because he didn't fully understand it himself, was how those few drops would soon become a teaspoon, then a tablespoon, then something Eleanor measured not in drops, but in the growing desperation with which she approached each empty bottle. The irony was as thick as London's autumn fog. In an era that prized feminine purity above all else, the very substances that were slowly enslaving women like Eleanor were sold as emblems of domestic virtue and maternal care. Patent medicines lined the shelves of respectable chemists, their labels promising relief from women's troubles, nervous exhaustion, and the mysterious ailments that seemed to plague the fairer sex with such reliable frequency. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup contained morphine. Godfrey's cordial was laced with laudanum. Dover's powder combined opium with ipecac. McMunn's elixir of opium promised relief from everything from consumption to heartbreak. And behind the ornate facades of Mayfair mansions and the lace-curtained windows of middle-class homes, Victorian women were quietly, unknowingly becoming dependent on these substances that society itself had pressed into their delicate hand. To understand how this silent epidemic took hold, we must first understand the peculiar architecture of Victorian womanhood, a structure built from such rigid expectations that it was perhaps inevitable that many would seek chemical refuge within its walls. Picture, if you will, the daily existence of a respectable Victorian lady. She rises before dawn not to begin her own pursuits, but to oversee a household that must run with clockwork precision while appearing effortlessly serene. Her corset pulls tight around ribs that struggle to expand with each shallow breath, fashion demanding that her waist measure no more than 20 inches, regardless of her natural build. Her dress weighs nearly 20 pounds with its layers of petticoats, bustles and heavy fabric. By afternoon, the combination of restricted breathing, physical discomfort, and the constant vigilance required to maintain perfect deportment has left her exhausted. But exhaustion in a lady is unseemly. Complaint is unthinkable. And so when Dr. Morrison suggests that a small dose of laudanum might ease her headaches, settle her nerves, or help her sleep more soundly, it seems not just reasonable but necessary. After all, she must be fit for the endless social obligations that define her worth, the morning calls that cannot be missed, the charitable committees that require her presence, the dinner parties where her conversation must sparkle without ever touching on anything too serious or intellectual. Mary Catherine Whitmore, a banker's wife living in Belgravia, kept a diary during these years, one of the few such documents to survive, with candid details about women's private use of patent medicine. Her entries, written in a careful copperplate hand, reveal the gradual progression from occasional relief to daily necessity. November 15, 1873. Dr. Patterson has given me a new tonic for my headaches. It tastes quite dreadful but does provide some relief from the pressure behind my temple. I took only half the recommended dose, as Mother always said a lady should be cautious with medicines. December 3, 1873. The tonic continues to help. I find I sleep much better when I take it before retiring. Charles remarked that I seem more serene at dinner parties. Perhaps this is what I have needed all along. February 18, 1874. I was quite distressed to find my bottle empty this morning. Sent Mary to the chemist immediately. I cannot face the ladies' auxiliary meeting without it. Mrs. Pemberton can be so trying, and I fear I might say something inappropriate if my nerves are not properly settled. July 30, 1874. I find I require the tonic not just in the evenings now, but before any social engagement. The thought of facing callers without it fills me with such anxiety. Charles mentioned the household expenses have risen. I pray he does not notice the frequency of my chemist purchases. Mary Catherine's story was being replicated in countless homes across London and throughout the British Isles. Women who had been raised to believe that their virtue lay in self-denial and service to others, found themselves dependent on substances that allowed them to continue performing these exhausting roles with apparent grace. The medical establishment, dominated entirely by men who had little understanding of women's actual experiences, pathologized perfectly normal responses to an abnormal situation. When a woman felt overwhelmed by caring for 6 children while managing a household on a limited budget, she was diagnosed with nervous exhaustion. When a young wife grieved the loss of a stillborn child, she suffered from female hysteria. When an older woman felt restless and confined after decades of living for others, she was afflicted with change of life melancholia. And for each of these conditions, these natural human responses to impossible circumstances, there was a bottle of medicine that promised relief. The transformation from relief to dependency rarely announced itself with drama. Instead, it crept into women's lives with the same quiet persistence as morning light stealing across a bedroom floor. The very nature of laudanum and morphine-based medicines made this progression almost inevitable. What doctors of the era didn't yet understand was that tolerance builds quickly, requiring ever-increasing doses to achieve the same soothing effect. Consider the experience of Agnes Hartwell, a clergyman's wife living in Camden. Agnes first encountered laudanum during a particularly difficult period in 1875 when her youngest son fell gravely ill with scarlet fever. For 6 weeks, she barely slept, sitting by his bedside through fevered nights, administering cool compresses and offering whispered prayers. When little Thomas finally recovered, Agnes found herself unable to return to normal sleep patterns. Her physician prescribed a few drops of laudanum to help reset her natural rhythms. The medicine worked beautifully, too beautifully. Not only did Agnes sleep peacefully, but the persistent anxiety that had plagued her throughout the crisis melted away. The weight of constantly managing a parsonage household, supporting her husband's ministry, and caring for 4 children while maintaining the demeanor of serene piety expected of a clergyman's wife, suddenly felt manageable. Agnes began taking laudanum not just for sleep, but for the calm confidence it provided during difficult parish visits, the patience it granted during long afternoons of darning and mending, the gentle euphoria that made even the most tedious domestic tasks feel somehow meaningful. She told herself she was simply maintaining her health so she could better serve her family and community, a rationalization that the moral framework of Victorian society actually supported. The progression followed a pattern that would become familiar to modern addiction specialists, though the vocabulary to describe it wouldn't exist for decades. First came tolerance. Agnes found she needed slightly more laudanum to achieve the same calming effect. Then came the morning anxiety that could only be soothed by an early dose. Soon she was timing her day around the medicine, planning social engagements and household tasks around when she could take her next dose without raising suspicion. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of this epidemic was how it trapped women in a web of shame and secrecy. Victorian society's obsession with moral purity meant that any suggestion of weakness or loss of control could destroy a woman's reputation entirely. Agnes could no more confess her growing dependency on laudanum than she could appear at Sunday service in her undergarments. The very respectability that had made these medicines acceptable in the first place now prevented women from seeking help when their use became problematic. Letters between sisters, mothers, and daughters, and close female friends from this period reveal the coded language women developed to discuss their struggles. They wrote of being unwell, of needing their medicine, of having difficult days that required additional comfort. Reading between the lines of these carefully worded correspondences, we can see women trying to reach out for understanding while maintaining the facade of propriety that their survival depended upon. Miss Elizabeth Fowler of Kensington wrote to her sister in Yorkshire, "I find myself quite dependent upon Dr. Mitchell's prescribed cordial for my nerves. I fear I have become rather too fond of its calming influence, but I cannot seem to manage without it. Please burn this letter. Charles must never know of my weakness." The isolation that these women experienced was profound. They were surrounded by family, friends, and social obligations, yet utterly alone with their growing dependency. The very structure of Victorian society, which demanded that women be available to everyone else's needs while denying the legitimacy of their own, created perfect conditions for this quiet epidemic to flourish. Perhaps no aspect of this hidden crisis was more heartbreaking than its impact on children. The same patent medicines that were ensnaring adult women were being administered to infants and young children with casual frequency. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Godfrey's cordial, and similar preparations were marketed specifically for childhood ailments, teething troubles, restlessness, minor illnesses, and were used by mothers who had no idea they were giving their children powerful narcotics. The irony was devastating. Women who prided themselves on their maternal devotion were unknowingly introducing their children to substances that could prove harmful or even fatal. Coroner's reports from London in the 1870s show a troubling pattern of infant deaths attributed to mysterious convulsions or failure to thrive, symptoms that modern medical knowledge would recognize as opiate overdose or withdrawal. Sarah Pembroke, a young mother living in Hampstead, recorded in her journal the tragic end of this well-intentioned care. "Baby William has been so fretful with his teething. Mrs. Henderson recommended Mrs. Winslow's syrup, and indeed it did calm him wonderfully, but this morning I found him so still, so very still. The doctor says his heart simply stopped beating. I cannot understand it. He seemed so peaceful when I gave him his medicine last night." The advertising for these products played directly into Victorian ideals of motherhood and domestic virtue. Manufacturers portrayed their morphine and opium-laced syrups as tools of good parenting, suggesting that mothers who failed to soothe their children's discomfort were somehow lacking in maternal instinct. The advertisements featured images of serene mothers holding peaceful babies, with testimonials from grateful parents praising the product's effectiveness. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, read one typical advertisement from, is the prescription of one of the best female physicians and nurses in the United States, and has been used for 30 years with never-failing success by millions of mothers for their children, from the teething infant of 1 week old to the adult. The language was deliberately reassuring, emphasizing the feminine expertise behind the product, the long history of successful use, and the broad age range for which it was supposedly safe. What the advertisements didn't mention was that the soothing effect came from morphine, or that the never-failing success in quieting children sometimes came at the ultimate cost. Some physicians of the era did raise concerns about these practices. Henry Ashby, a Manchester-based pediatrician, published warnings about the dangers of patent medicines for children as early as 8, but his voice was largely drowned out by the commercial interests promoting these products and the cultural momentum that made them seem both necessary and virtuous. The most tragic cases were those where mothers themselves, dependent on laudanum or similar preparations, inadvertently gave their children overdoses because their own judgment was impaired. Court records from this period include several cases of mothers charged with infant death by neglect, when the real culprit was their own opiate-clouded perception of appropriate dosing. Beyond the immediate physical dangers, children growing up in households where opiate use was normalized faced subtler but equally troubling consequences. They learned that emotional distress was something to be medicated away rather than understood and addressed. They absorbed the lesson that calm could be purchased in a bottle, that discomfort was intolerable, that the solution to life's difficulties lay in chemical alteration of one's mental state. While women of all classes found themselves caught in this web of chemical dependency, the epidemic's impact varied dramatically based on economic circumstance. Wealthy women like Eleanor Ashworth could afford to maintain their habits with expensive imported laudanum and consultation with private physicians who asked few questions. Middle-class women like Agnes Hartwell and Mary Catherine Whitmore walked a precarious line, managing their needs while trying not to strain household budgets or attract their husbands' attention to increasing chemist expenses. But for working-class women, the seamstresses, laundresses, shopgirls, and domestic servants who formed the invisible backbone of Victorian society, the situation was far more desperate. Consider the life of Molly Quinn, an Irish immigrant working as a scullery maid in a Mayfair mansion. Molly's introduction to opium came through the household where she worked. She observed her mistress taking laudanum for her nerves, and during a particularly difficult period when Molly was working 18-hour days while suffering from an abscessed tooth, she helped herself to a small amount from the medicine cabinet. The relief was immediate and profound. Not only did the laudanum ease her physical pain, but it made the endless drudgery of scrubbing floors and washing dishes feel somehow bearable, even pleasant. For a young woman who sent most of her wages back to her starving family in Ireland, who worked from before dawn until well past midnight, who slept on a straw mattress in a basement room that flooded whenever it rained heavily. Those few moments of euphoric relief felt like salvation itself. But Molly couldn't afford the quality preparations available to her employers. She turned instead to the cheapest opium preparations available in London's East End. Crude tinctures sold by street vendors, smoking opium in the dens of Limehouse, whatever could provide relief at a price she could manage. These substances were often adulterated with dangerous compounds, inconsistent in strength, and sold in environments that put already vulnerable women at additional risk. The economic pressure created a vicious cycle. Women like Molly would spend their meager wages on opium, leaving them even less able to afford adequate food, clothing, or shelter. Their deteriorating physical condition made their daily labor more difficult, which in turn increased their need for chemical relief. Many found themselves trading sexual favors for drugs or stealing from employers, actions that would have been unthinkable to them before dependency took hold. Police records from the Metropolitan Police Archives reveal the gendered nature of opium-related crime during this period. While men were more likely to be arrested for public intoxication or violent behavior while under the influence, women were predominantly charged with theft. Small amounts of money, jewelry, or household items taken to purchase their next dose. The contrast with wealthy women's experiences was stark. Mrs. Ashworth could maintain her dependency indefinitely without legal consequences, social censure, or serious financial hardship. Her behavior might be whispered about in drawing rooms, but her class position insulated her from the criminal justice system and provided access to medical care when her health declined. Working-class women had no such protection. When their dependency became obvious, they faced dismissal from employment, arrest, and imprisonment. The workhouses, Victorian society's institutions for dealing with the destitute, were filled with women whose lives had been destroyed by opiate dependency, though the connection was rarely recognized or acknowledged by authorities. The patent medicine industry profited enormously from this demographic divide. They marketed expensive, elegantly packaged preparations to middle and upper-class customers, while also supplying the crude, dangerous substances that desperate working-class users turned to when they couldn't afford anything better. The same companies that sold refined laudanum to Belgravia drawing rooms also sold raw opium to East End dens. On one hand, these substances provided genuine relief for many conditions that Victorian medicine could treat in no other way. On the other hand, perceptive physicians were beginning to notice patterns of dependency among their female patients that troubled them deeply. Dr. Edmund Parks, who maintained a practice in Bloomsbury and treated many middle-class women, wrote privately to a colleague in 1876, "I find myself in an impossible situation regarding the feminine use of laudanum. When I prescribe it for legitimate medical complaints, I observe remarkable improvement in my patients' conditions. Yet I cannot ignore that many of these same women return to me with increasing frequency, requesting stronger doses for increasingly vague complaints. I fear I am creating more problems than I am solving." The challenge was compounded by the limited understanding of addiction that existed in Victorian medical theory. The concept of psychological dependency was virtually unknown. Doctors understood that people could develop a tolerance to medicines, requiring larger doses for the same effect, but they didn't grasp the complex neurochemical processes that make recovery from opiate dependency so difficult. Moreover, Victorian medical training provided doctors with virtually no insight into women's actual experience. Medical schools were exclusively male institutions, and the prevailing medical texts treated women as essentially defective versions of men, naturally weaker, more emotional, and prone to mysterious ailments that had no clear physical cause. When women reported symptoms of anxiety, depression, or chronic pain, doctors had few tools beyond opiate medication to offer relief. Dr. William Morrison, Eleanor Ashworth's physician, exemplified this well-meaning but ultimately harmful approach. His medical journal, preserved in the Royal College of Physicians' archives, reveals a doctor genuinely concerned about his patients' welfare, but trapped within the limitations of his era's understanding. Mrs. returned today, complaining of the same nervous symptoms that have plagued her for months. She appears well-nourished and shows no signs of organic disease, yet she insists that without her medicine she cannot function in her daily duties. I am convinced that her distress is genuine, though I cannot identify its source. I have increased her laudanum prescription, though I admit to some uneasiness about her growing reliance upon it. The most progressive physicians of the era were beginning to recognize that many of their female patients' symptoms might be related to their social circumstances rather than purely medical conditions. But Victorian society offered few alternatives to pharmaceutical intervention. Doctors couldn't prescribe better marriages, financial independence, meaningful work, or relief from the crushing social expectations that made so many women's lives unbearable. Some physicians attempted to wean their patients off opiate medications, but they had little understanding of proper withdrawal management. Patients who tried to stop using laudanum or morphine suddenly often experienced severe physical and emotional symptoms that seemed to confirm the original need for medication. Without proper support or gradual reduction protocols, most women found it impossible to discontinue their medicines independently. A few doctors, particularly those working with poorer populations who saw the devastating effects of opiate dependency more starkly, began advocating for different approaches. Dr. Martha Hughes Cannon, one of the first female physicians in Britain, though practicing primarily in America during this period, wrote presciently about the need for alternative treatments for women's emotional distress. We must ask ourselves whether the epidemic of nervous disorders among women might be symptomatic of their constrained circumstances rather than inherent feminine weakness. Perhaps what we term hysteria is simply the natural response of intelligent beings to lives that offer them no outlet for their capabilities, no recognition of their humanity beyond their service to others. But such voices were rare and largely ignored by the medical establishment. The easier solution for doctors, patients, and society as a whole was to continue prescribing medicines that masked the symptoms of women's distress, without addressing their underlying causes. In the absence of medical understanding or social support, Victorian women created their own networks of mutual aid around their shared experiences with opiate medicines. These informal support systems operated entirely outside official channels, conducted through coded conversations, carefully worded letters, and the subtle communications possible among women who shared similar constraints. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore's diary reveals glimpses of this underground community. Called upon Mrs. Henderson this afternoon, she seemed to understand immediately when I mentioned my nerves had been troubling me. Without my saying anything directly, she recommended her own chemist and suggested I might benefit from the same preparation that has helped her through difficult times. There is such relief in speaking with someone who truly understands. These networks served multiple functions. Women shared information about which preparations were most effective, which physicians were most understanding, and which chemists asked the fewest questions. They provided emotional support that was impossible to find elsewhere, offering the rare comfort of being understood without judgment. More importantly, they developed practical strategies for managing their dependencies while maintaining the facade of respectability that their survival required. They learned to time their doses around social obligations, to disguise the smell of laudanum with peppermint or rose water, to account for increasing chemist expenses in household budgets without arousing suspicion. Lady Margaret Thornfield, the wife of a prominent member of Parliament, became an inadvertent leader in one such network. Her Belgravia drawing room became an informal meeting place for women struggling with similar issues, though the topic was never discussed directly. Instead, they spoke in careful euphemisms about maintaining one's constitution, managing delicate health, and finding strength for life's demands. Lady Margaret's correspondence with women across London and beyond reveals the scope of this hidden epidemic. Letters arrived from Scotland, Ireland, and even British colonies, all seeking advice and support from women who shared their experiences. The letters were models of Victorian propriety on the surface, but contained detailed practical advice about managing opiate dependency. "My dear Mrs. Pemberton," wrote Lady Margaret to a woman in Edinburgh, "I was so pleased to receive your letter inquiring about my health regimen. Indeed, I have found that the constitutional medicine prescribed by Dr. Morrison has been most beneficial. I take it at regular intervals throughout the day, and have found that consistency is most important. I would caution against any sudden alterations in dosage, as I have found this leads to most disagreeable symptoms. Please give my regards to your husband, and do write again soon with news of your progress." These women also developed sophisticated strategies for obtaining their medicines without detection. They established relationships with multiple chemists to avoid suspicion from frequent purchases at one location. They sent servants to make purchases, claiming the medicines were for elderly relatives or sick children. Some even arranged to have medicines delivered directly to trusted friends' homes to avoid having the packages arrive at their own addresses. The psychological support these networks provided was perhaps even more valuable than the practical assistance. For women who had been taught that any loss of self-control was a moral failing, finding others who shared their struggles offered profound relief from shame and isolation. They learned they were not uniquely weak or sinful, but were instead responding to impossible circumstances in ways that many other intelligent, caring women had also found necessary. Yet even within these supportive relationships, the full extent of individual dependency often remained hidden. Victorian standards of propriety were so deeply ingrained that even women who were helping each other manage their opiate use rarely admitted to the full scope of their own struggles. They remained isolated even within their communities of mutual support. By the late 1870s, the consequences of widespread opiate use among Victorian women were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, even for a society that excelled at not seeing what it preferred not to acknowledge. Coroners' reports showed rising rates of accidental poisoning among women and children. Hospital admissions for mysterious nervous disorders were increasing. Most tellingly, the sheer volume of patent medicine sales had grown so dramatically that even government officials began to take notice. The turning point came not from medical breakthroughs or social reform, but from an unexpected source: the temperance movement. The same Victorian women who were struggling with opiate dependency were also the backbone of efforts to limit alcohol consumption, seeing it as a threat to family stability and moral order. When temperance advocates began to realize that many of their most dedicated members were themselves dependent on substances that were arguably more dangerous than alcohol, it created a crisis that could no longer be politely ignored. Mrs. Frances Willett, a prominent temperance leader who visited London frequently during this period, wrote candidly about this discovery. "I have come to the terrible realization that while we have been crusading against the evils of drugs, we have ignored an equally devastating plague that has taken root in our own parlors. The very women who sign our pledges of sobriety are dosing themselves daily with preparations that contain substances far more powerful than anything served in the public houses we condemn." The revelation created a profound moral crisis for the temperance movement. How could they condemn working-class men for seeking relief from their hardships in gin houses while ignoring middle-class women who sought the same escape in laudanum bottles? The contradiction forced a more honest examination of the social conditions that drove people of all classes to seek chemical comfort. Some of the first serious attempts to address opiate dependency among women came from within the temperance movement itself. Organizations that had developed effective strategies for helping people overcome alcohol dependency began adapting their approaches for opiate use. They created private residential facilities where women could withdraw from their medicines under medical supervision, away from the social pressures and daily stresses that had contributed to their dependency. The London Female Temperance Union established what they called rest homes for women suffering from nervous exhaustion, a euphemistic way of describing opiate withdrawal that allowed women to seek help without admitting to drug dependence. These facilities provided medical care, nutritious food, and perhaps most importantly, an environment where women could rest without the constant demands of household management and social obligation. Eleanor Ashworth, whose story we began with, was among the first women to seek help at one of these facilities. Her decision came after a terrifying incident where she accidentally took a potentially fatal dose of laudanum, mistaking her evening medicine for her morning dose due to the mental fog that chronic opiate use had created. Eleanor's recovery, as recorded in letters to her sister, was neither quick nor easy. The first days were almost unbearable. I felt as though my very skin was crawling and I could not stop trembling. But the nurses here understand, and Dr. Matthews has been most kind. For the first time in years, I am beginning to remember what it feels like to face the day without first reaching for a bottle. The medical profession also began to evolve its understanding, though slowly and unevenly. Some physicians started recognizing that gradual reduction of opiate medicines was more effective than sudden cessation. They began paying more attention to the underlying conditions that had led women to seek chemical relief in the first place. Dr. Morrison, reflecting on his practice in a letter to a medical colleague, showed the beginning of this changing perspective. I have come to believe that much of what we term feminine hysteria might be better understood as a reasonable response to unreasonable circumstance. Perhaps our role should be not simply to quiet these women's distress, but to help them find ways to address its sources. As awareness of the opiate epidemic began to grow, some Victorian women found the courage to speak publicly about their experiences, though always carefully and within the bounds of what society could bear to hear. These women, primarily from middle and upper classes who had some protection from social censure, became inadvertent pioneers in what would much later be recognized as addiction recovery advocacy. Mrs. Sarah Elizabeth Tooley, a journalist and social reformer, published what may have been the first public account of a woman's recovery from opiate dependency. Writing in the British Women's Temperance Journal, she used the pseudonym, A Reformed Lady, but her article was clearly autobiographical. For 3 years I lived as though behind a veil of silk that softened all the sharp edges of existence, but also obscured its true colors and texture. What began as medicine for genuine suffering became a prison more confining than any external chains. I write not to shock or sensationalize, but to offer hope to other women who may recognize themselves in these words. Her account was revolutionary in its honesty about the progression from medical need to dependency, and in its refusal to frame addiction as a moral failing. Instead, she wrote about it as a medical condition that required understanding and treatment, not judgment and The response to her article was extraordinary. The journal received hundreds of letters from women across Britain and its colonies, many sharing their own stories of struggle with opiate medicine. For the first time, the true scope of this hidden epidemic became visible, even if only within the relatively safe space of a temperance publication. These letters, preserved in the Women's Temperance Union archives, provide some of the most authentic insights we have into Victorian women's experiences with opiate dependency. They reveal not just the practical aspects of addiction but the emotional and spiritual toll it took on women who had been raised to believe their worth lay in service to others. I became a stranger to myself, wrote one correspondent from Manchester. The woman who had once taken pride in managing her household with efficiency and grace was replaced by someone who could think of nothing but when she might next take her medicine. I lost years of my children's lives to that fog, and though I have been clean now for 8 months, the guilt of those lost years weighs upon me daily. Another letter from a clergyman's wife in Yorkshire revealed the particular burden carried by women in positions of moral authority. How does one confess to a congregation that looks to you as an example of Christian virtue that you have been enslaved by a substance you first took in the name of maintaining your health? I felt like the greatest hypocrite when I stood beside my husband as he preached about sin and redemption, knowing that I was living a lie. Perhaps most poignantly, many letters came from women who were still struggling with dependency, but had found hope in reading about others' recovery. These women wrote seeking practical advice about withdrawal, but also something more precious: the assurance that recovery was possible, that they were not permanently damaged, that there was life beyond the body. The publication of these accounts, even in the limited context of temperance publications, began to shift public conversation about opiate use. Medical journals started publishing more sophisticated discussions of addiction and withdrawal. Social reformers began including opiate dependency in their broader critiques of the conditions that made working class and women's lives so difficult. Most importantly, women themselves began to organize more formally around mutual support for recovery. The informal networks that had previously focused on managing dependency began to evolve into groups focused on overcoming it. These early recovery communities developed many of the principles that would later become central to addiction treatment: Pierce's honest acknowledgement of the problem, gradual progress rather than immediate perfection, and addressing underlying life circumstances along with chemical dependence. As the first generation of children who had grown up in households touched by the opiate epidemic reached adulthood, their voices added a new dimension to understanding its impact. These young people, now in their 20s and 30s by the 1880s and 1890s, had observed their mothers' struggles with a clarity that the adults around them had often lacked. Miss Catherine Morrison, no relation to Morrison, writing in her private memoirs, recalled her childhood in a home where laudanum was as much a part of the daily routine as morning prayers. Mother's medicine bottles lined the shelf in her dressing room like soldiers in formation. As a child, I thought this was normal, that all mothers needed their nerve tonics to face the day. It wasn't until I visited school friends' homes that I realized other mothers didn't measure their days by doses, didn't time social engagements around when they could take their medicine without being observed. Catherine's observations were particularly keen regarding the way opiate use affected family dynamics. She noted how her mother's moods became tied to the timing of her medicine, how household routines were subtly arranged to accommodate her needs, how even the children learned to read the signs that indicated whether mother was having a difficult day that required extra consideration. We became experts at managing mother's condition without ever speaking of it directly. Father would suggest that perhaps mother should rest during particularly demanding social periods. We children learned to be quieter in the afternoons when she was most likely to be feeling unwell. The whole household revolved around something that was never named or acknowledged. These adult children also provided insights into the long-term consequences of growing up with opiate-dependent parents. Many reported struggling with anxiety about their own responses to pain or stress, worried that they might carry some inherited weakness that would lead them down the same path. Others described feeling responsible for their mother's conditions, believing that if they had been better children, perhaps their mothers wouldn't have needed